On a cold morning in late February 2022, satellite photos showed something that should have terrified Ukraine. A column of Russian vehicles, dozens of kilometers long, stacked bumper to bumper on the road toward Kyiv. Tanks, armored vehicles, fuel trucks. On paper, it was the kind of steel avalanche that Soviet doctrine had promised for decades. In reality, that column became a graveyard. Burned-out hulks. Abandoned T-72s with hatches open. Vehicles stuck in mud, left with full ammunition racks. From that moment on, you could see the beginning of what many analysts now call the Russian tank collapse. So what actually collapsed? Was it Russian armored technology? Was it the crews? Was it the doctrine? Or was it something more fundamental? A system built for fast, decisive offensives that suddenly found itself in a long war under the crosshairs of modern sensors, drones, and smart munitions. In this analysis, I want to walk you through how Russian armor went from the core of Moscow's offensive power to a symbol of vulnerability, why so many tanks ended up in flames, and what that means for any army that still believes the tank is the unquestioned king of land warfare. To understand the collapse, we have to start with expectations. Before the full-scale invasion, Russian ground forces were built around the idea of battalion tactical groups, compact combined arms packages with tanks, mechanized infantry, artillery, air defense, engineers, and logistics. On paper, a BTG was supposed to be flexible, lethal, and self-sufficient for high-intensity operations. Russian exercises in the 2010s were full of these formations, punching through enemy lines with tank-led shock and speed. Western analysts often assumed that if Russia went to war in Europe, these BTGs and their tanks would be at the center of a rapid, deep operation. The political assumption in Moscow was simple. Ukraine would crack quickly. Russian armor would exploit weak points. Major cities would be isolated while airborne units seized key airfields. The tank, again, was the physical symbol of that plan. If infantry is the face of war, the main battle tank is its fist. The problem is straightforward. You can have a powerful fist, but if the eyes, the brain, and the supply lines are weak, that fist will punch into thin air. Or worse, into an ambush. From day one, you could already see the mismatch between doctrine and reality. Russian columns pushed along predictable roads, often without proper reconnaissance on the flanks. Electronic warfare, air defense, artillery, and infantry support existed, but they did not always arrive in the right place at the right time. Tanks advanced ahead of dismounted infantry. Convoys parked tightly together. Logistics units were exposed. In a modern battlefield saturated with anti-tank weapons and drones, this is not maneuver warfare. This is a moving target range. You might think that what destroyed Russian armor was just Western technology, Javelin missiles, NLAW, precision artillery. That is only half the story. The deeper truth is that Russian tanks burned because an entire system around them failed. Command and control, logistics, intelligence, training, industrial capacity. Each of these layers cracked in its own way. The flames you saw on those wrecks were really the visible symptom of an invisible chain of failures behind them. Before we talk about how the tanks died, we need to answer a simple question. What did Russia actually bring into this war in terms of armor, and what was waiting on the other side of the front line? On the eve of the invasion, Russia fielded one of the largest tank fleets on the planet. The core of its active units consisted of modernized Soviet designs. T-72B3 and T-72B3M, T-80BV and T-80BVM, T-90A and the more advanced T-90M Proriv. These tanks featured improved engines, thermal sights, and explosive reactive armor such as Contact 5 and Relict. On paper, they were credible opponents for any NATO standard tank in a frontal engagement at medium range. The T-72B3M, for example, typically mounts a 125mm smoothbore gun, updated fire control, and improved relict blocks on turret and hull. The T-90M goes further with enhanced armor layout, better crew ergonomics, and modern optics, including thermal imagers that finally bring Russian night fighting closer to Western standards. Russian industry had started a gradual shift toward newer hulls and deeper upgrades, but the fleet remained a layered mix: old hulls with new modules, modern tanks in elite units, less advanced ones in secondary formations. Behind the active fleet stood storage bases filled with older models: T-62s, T-64s, and even T-55s and T-54s. For years, these vehicles were seen as a strategic reserve. If a major war came, Russia could refurbish thousands of stored tanks and flood the battlefield with armor. That was the theory. Once the war in Ukraine turned into a grinding contest of attrition, that theory was put to the test. What we saw instead was that many of these stored tanks were in poor condition, cannibalized for parts, exposed to decades of weather. Bringing them back was possible, but at a cost in time, quality, and survivability. By 2023 and 2024, images began to show very old models like the T-62 and even T-55 returning to frontline duty, sometimes with improvised armor, sometimes with cage structures and extra blocks welded on. From a purely technical perspective, putting a 1960s-era design into a battlefield full of smart munitions, drones, and precision artillery is not force modernization. It is an act of desperation. It tells you that the reserve of usable modern tanks is shrinking faster than industry can regenerate it. Now look at the other side. Ukraine started the war with a smaller tank fleet, mostly Soviet-era T-64s, some T-72s, and later Western-supplied Leopard 2s and Challenger 2s. In a pure tank versus tank duel, Russian numbers should have given Moscow an advantage, but Ukraine built something different. Instead of relying on heavy armored formations to match Russia tank for tank, Kyiv constructed a layered anti-armor ecosystem. Infantry teams with Javelin and NLAW, domestic Stugna P and Corsair missiles, artillery with precision-guided shells, mines, and very quickly, a dense web of drones to find and strike targets. This mattered more than the raw number of tanks. If you create a battlefield where every kilometer of advance brings you into dozens of overlapping kill zones, the side that pushes big armored columns forward is inherently exposed, especially when that side underestimates how fast the enemy will adapt. Russian forces entered a battle space where any vehicle moving by day could be spotted by quadcopters. Any static position could be geolocated for artillery. Any damaged tank could be finished off by cheap loitering munitions or small drones dropping explosives. The tank was no longer just fighting infantry and other tanks. It was fighting a whole system. Open source intelligence gives us some hard numbers. The Oryx project, which only counts visually confirmed losses, has documented thousands of destroyed, damaged, abandoned, or captured Russian tanks. Over 4,000 tanks by their tally, with total Russian armored vehicle losses of around 14,000 units by late 2024. Remember, that is a lower bound, because only vehicles with photographic or video evidence are counted. Independent analysis by institutes such as the International Institute for Strategic Studies and other Western research centers broadly supports the idea that Russian tank losses reached levels comparable to or exceeding the pre-war active fleet. Russian industry is trying to compensate by ramping up production and deep modernization of T-72B3M and T-90M tanks, sometimes delivering multiple train loads at a time. But production estimates in the range of perhaps 140 to 300 new or modernized tanks per year tell you something important. Even if those numbers are accurate, they struggle to match the cumulative attrition of a long war. So at the macro level, we see a simple imbalance. Russia entered with a huge fleet and high hopes for its armored spearhead. Ukraine countered with a layered defense that punished every mistake. Losses on the Russian side outpaced regeneration. Stored tanks were pulled out of depots faster than factories could produce new ones. The result was not just fewer tanks. It was a gradual decline in the average quality of vehicles and crews being sent forward. That is how a quantitative advantage turns into a qualitative problem. But numbers alone do not explain why so many tanks ended up as smoking wrecks in the first months. To see that, we have to zoom down to the level of tactics. How were these tanks actually used? The Russian battalion tactical group concept is crucial to understanding the tactical picture. On paper, a BTG includes around 10 tanks, up to 40 infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery, air defense, engineers, and logistics. The idea is to have a modular, high-readiness unit that can rapidly deploy and fight without waiting for the rest of the brigade. In Russian planning, armored BTGs were supposed to lead thrusts, break through local defenses, and exploit gaps created by artillery and airstrikes. In practice, several problems appeared immediately. First, the Russian army went into Ukraine with BTGs under strength in infantry. Many groups had plenty of tanks and armored vehicles, but not enough dismounted soldiers to secure flanks, clear forests and villages, and protect columns from ambush. This is especially dangerous in terrain with many small settlements, tree lines, and side roads. In other words, almost the entire north and east of Ukraine. Second, coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and drones was often weak. There were cases where tanks moved ahead without proper reconnaissance. Columns drove into urban areas or narrow roads with minimal screening. Artillery fire was not always synchronized with movement. When you run armor as if it is still 1980, but the opponent is fighting with 2024 level sensors and munitions, you create an ideal environment for ambushes. Think of the early battles around Kyiv. Russian columns driving through towns like Bucha, Irpin, and along the Brovary axis suffered heavy losses from anti-tank teams firing from buildings and tree lines. Videos show T-72s and T-80s being hit from the side and rear, often because they were not properly covered by infantry. If a tank is forced to fight close range in an urban or wooded environment without dismounted protection, its armor and firepower become much less decisive. A similar story played out at Vuhledar. Russian Marines and mechanized units attempted repeated armored assaults over open ground. They ran into deeply mined approaches, and Ukrainian forces with good observation from high-rise buildings in the town. Columns of T-72s and T-80s advanced along narrow lanes. When the leading vehicles hit mines and stalled, the rest bunched up behind them. Artillery and anti-tank fire then destroyed multiple vehicles in a single engagement. This is the classic problem of channelized armor without engineering and reconnaissance leading the way. If you look at this from the tank crew's perspective, the picture is grim. You are driving a 30 or 40-ton vehicle into an area where you do not have clear information about mines, enemy positions, or flanking threats. Your supporting infantry may be riding on the hull or inside other vehicles rather than walking forward. Drones overhead are not always yours. The first sign of danger might be a sudden explosion under the track or a shaped charge striking the turret. In that environment, crew survival and morale suffer quickly. Another key factor was how Russian forces used artillery and air power. Russian doctrine relies heavily on massed fires to suppress and destroy enemy defenses before the advance of armor. In Ukraine, Russian artillery did inflict huge destruction, but fire was often less precise in the early months and not always responsive enough to real-time information. Meanwhile, Ukrainian units increasingly used small drones to guide their own artillery, making their anti-armor fires more accurate. In effect, Russian tanks were often entering areas that were not fully neutralized, while Ukrainian anti-tank teams and guns still had enough strength to hit them. Some people like to say that Western missiles killed Russian tanks. I would put it differently. Western missiles and Ukrainian drones punished Russian tactical errors. The weapons were dangerous, but the way tanks were used turned danger into disaster. Now add the drone revolution on top of this. By the second year of the war, small first-person view drones and quadcopters became the most cost-effective tank killers on the battlefield. These drones, often built from commercial components and fitted with explosive charges, could be flown into the weaker parts of a tank: engine deck, turret ring, rear hull, or they could precisely drop munitions into open hatches. The cost exchange is brutal. A few $100s of electronics and explosives trading against a vehicle worth millions and a trained crew that cannot be replaced easily. Ukrainian companies even began producing specialized thermite incendiary munitions for drones that burn hot enough to make a damaged tank unrecoverable. Once a vehicle is immobilized or abandoned, these firebombs are used to ensure it is truly dead. This matters because traditional tank warfare assumed that many damaged tanks could be repaired and returned to service. On this battlefield, a crippled tank is not just disabled, it is cremated. Russian forces tried to adapt with improvised cope cages on tank roofs and sides. Cage structures, extra armor plates, layers of logs, sandbags, and even rubber tires. Some of these modifications help in specific situations, for example, breaking the fuse on simple-shaped charges. But they also add weight, reduce mobility, and sometimes interfere with the turret or sensors. When you start to see tanks covered in scrap metal and household items, you know the crew has lost confidence in the vehicle's original protection. That is a psychological collapse as much as a technical one. Design vulnerabilities of Russian tanks amplified these problems. Most Russian tanks still use a carousel-style autoloader with ammunition stored under the turret. If a penetrator reaches that carousel, the propellant cases can ignite and cause the turret to be blown off. The famous jack-in-the-box effect that has been observed in multiple conflicts. Newer models like the T-90M improve ammunition storage and add extra protection. But many vehicles in Ukraine are older designs or partial upgrades. When these tanks are hit by modern tandem warhead missiles or precisely aimed artillery submunitions, catastrophic kills are more common. At this point, you might ask yourself something. If your tanks are this vulnerable to top attack and drones, why keep pushing them forward at all? The answer is harsh. Because the alternative for Russian commanders is often worse. Infantry without armored support takes even heavier losses when attacking fortified positions. Without tanks, it is difficult to punch through layered defenses with mines, trenches, and strongpoints. So the tank remains in use, but more cautiously, and often in roles that do not exploit its full potential. Indirect fire from hull-down positions. Static pillbox-style defense, limited local counterattacks rather than deep thrusts. One of the most revealing indicators of the tank collapse is how many vehicles were abandoned rather than destroyed in direct combat. OSINT tracking shows a significant fraction of Russian tanks lost as abandoned. In some cases, this was due to mechanical failures or fuel shortages. In others, crews simply decided not to stay with a vehicle that they no longer trusted to protect them. In the early chaotic weeks, Ukrainian farmers towing away intact Russian tanks became an almost surreal symbol of the war. Funny on social media, yes. But underneath the humor, that is a sign of a force whose armored spearhead has lost cohesion. Russian adaptation has been real. They have improved camouflage, decoys, and dispersion. They use more smoke. They shift to tank fire from longer ranges and more static defensive roles. They field more electronic warfare systems to disrupt Ukrainian drones. And they integrate their own drones into artillery and armor operations. But each adaptation also concedes something. A tank forced to hide, fire indirectly, and constantly fear cheap drones is no longer the confident breakthrough vehicle of old Doctrine. It becomes one more vulnerable node in a long, fragile supply chain. To really see how the Russian tank situation evolved, we need to look at the war in phases. Because the meaning of collapse changes depending on the year you examine. In 2022, the story was sudden shock and heavy losses. Russia launched multi-axis offensives aiming for Kyiv, Kharkiv, and the south. Armored columns pushed along roads and through towns, often in long traffic jams. Ukrainian forces, although outgunned on paper, had the advantage of shorter lines, better local knowledge, and quickly increasing flows of Western anti-tank weapons. The result was catastrophic for Russian armor in several areas. The attempted thrust toward Kyiv from Belarus is the most obvious example. Tanks and armored vehicles advanced through Hostomel, Bucha, and Irpin. The airborne assault on Hostomel Airport failed to secure a stable airhead. Follow-on armored units got bogged down. Ambushes, broken bridges, and logistical chaos turned the armored fist into a stuck column. Weeks later, the retreat left behind a trail of destroyed and abandoned tanks. From a strategic perspective, this was the moment where the myth of unstoppable Russian armor died. The Kharkiv region later told a similar story in a different way. When Ukraine launched its counteroffensive there in late 2022, Russian forces withdrew in haste. A large number of vehicles, including tanks, were left behind in working or repairable condition. This is not just a loss of hardware, it is a transfer. Captured tanks do not simply disappear. Many were reused by Ukraine against their former owners. So the tank collapse in that region was also a gift to the opponent's armored forces. By the end of 2022, Russian armored losses were so significant that Moscow shifted its approach. Instead of trying to use tanks in rapid thrusts on multiple axes, the war became more static. Heavy armor was increasingly used to support grinding assaults in places like Bakhmut, where the main attrition fell on infantry and artillery. In that sense, the tank collapse of 2022 forced a move from maneuver warfare toward attritional siege-style tactics. Not because Russia preferred it at the strategic level, but because armored spearheads could not reliably achieve decisive breakthroughs. In 2023, the picture changed again. This time, Ukraine was the side attempting major offensives in the south and east. Western tanks like the Leopard 2 and Challenger 2 entered the battlefield in limited numbers. Russia responded with dense minefields, layered defenses, and heavy use of artillery and drones to stop advances. Ironically, some of the same vulnerabilities that wrecked Russian tanks early in the war now threatened Ukrainian armor as it tried to push through fortified lines. For Russia, this phase allowed its tanks to be used more defensively, in firing positions behind minefields rather than charging forward in long columns. This does not mean Russian tank losses stopped, but their profile changed. More vehicles were destroyed by artillery and drones while supporting trench line defense and local counterattacks. Fewer were lost in deep advances that never materialized. You could say that the tank did not recover its old glory, but it found a grim new role as the mobile gun of a static front. If you like dark humor, you could call this the tracked bunker phase of Russian armor. By 2024 and 2025, a second layer of the collapse became clear: industrial and logistical strain. As losses accumulated, Russia began drawing more heavily on its storage depots and ramping up production in plants like Uralvagonzavod. Analysts estimate that production of T-90M and upgraded T-72B3M tanks grew steadily, possibly reaching over 200 units per year or more in some assessments. Trainloads of modernized tanks were delivered straight to units deployed in Ukraine. At the same time, however, Moscow reactivated older tanks. T-62s, T-55s, and even T-54s appeared at the front. When you see such vehicles deployed alongside much more modern T-72B3M or T-90M tanks, you are looking at an army that is spending its reserves faster than it can replace them with top-tier equipment. Sanctions and battlefield damage have also affected Russian industry. Even if factories can refurbish hundreds of tanks per year, questions remain about the quality of armor and optics available under constrained supply chains. Meanwhile, ammunition and logistics problems pushed Russian forces toward increasingly improvised solutions. Reports and imagery show civilian vehicles, including cheap off-road cars used near the front. Tanks are still there, but the overall mechanized system around them is under stress. In some sectors, Ukrainian observers have even noted the use of horses and other non-standard transport inside Russian logistics nodes. When a modern army begins to move supplies with animals near the front line, you know that armored mobility is no longer what it was at the start of the war. The human cost is equally important. Studies by Western institutes suggest that Russian casualties may have reached close to 1 million killed and wounded by mid-decade, with hundreds of thousands of dead. Tank crews, as highly exposed combat troops, are a significant part of that toll. Losing a tank is bad. Losing experienced crewmen is worse, because training a competent tank commander and gunner takes years, not months. As the war drags on, new crews are rushed through shortened courses and thrown into extremely lethal conditions. This further reduces the effective quality of armored units. You end up with a feedback loop. High losses of tanks and crews reduce unit quality. Reduced quality leads to more mistakes and higher vulnerability. Higher vulnerability causes more losses. Against that, Russian industry and recruitment are pushing hard to keep numbers up. But quantity without quality has limits, especially in a battlefield where every movement is watched by drones and every mistake is punished by precision fire. So what does all of this tell us about the tank as a system? Has the Russian tank collapse proven that the age of armor is over? Or has it just revealed which armies do not know how to use armor in modern conditions? The first lesson is that protection now means much more than thick steel and explosive bricks. Traditional tank design focused on defeating kinetic and chemical energy threats in the frontal arc. In Ukraine, most lethal attacks come from above or from flanks exposed while maneuvering in complex terrain. Top armor on many Russian tanks is relatively thin. Even reactive armor on turrets and hulls does not fully cover the areas that FPV drones and top attack missiles aim for. The result is a battlefield where the physical armor of the vehicle is no longer the final line of defense. It is just one layer in a stack that must include electronic warfare, active protection, decoys, dispersion, and constant movement. Active protection systems that can detect and physically intercept incoming missiles, and perhaps even some drones, will be crucial in future designs. Russia has fielded limited numbers of such systems, but they have not been ubiquitous across the fleet. Western tanks also face similar issues. So the lesson is not that Russian armor is uniquely flawed. The lesson is that any army sending tanks into a battlefield full of cheap flying explosives without a serious active protection and drone countermeasure architecture is asking for wrecks. The second lesson is doctrinal. Tanks cannot operate as isolated spearheads. They need a dense web of reconnaissance, infantry, engineers, artillery, air defense, and electronic warfare working in real time. Russian BTGs theoretically provided this, but execution failed under the stress of real operations in Ukraine. Infantry was too thin. Engineers were not always forward enough to clear mines. Air defense coverage was uneven, letting small drones stalk armored columns. Artillery was powerful but sometimes poorly coordinated. The result was armor that moved faster than the support system around it. In a modern sensor-heavy battle space, that is fatal. This is not just a Russian problem. Any army that builds impressive combined arms structures on paper but cannot execute them under fire will suffer similar outcomes. The difference in Ukraine is simply that Russian armor had to discover this the hard way, under constant observation by the world. The third lesson is industrial and logistical. Russia entered the war with huge stocks of Soviet-era equipment. For decades, many analysts believed that these depots were a strategic trump card. If a long war came, Moscow could just pull thousands of tanks from storage. The reality has been more complicated. Refurbishing a tank that has sat for 30 years is not a quick process. You need spare parts, skilled workers, and quality control. Sanctions and battlefield damage cut into all three. At the same time, the pace of combat losses means that even an expanded production line struggles to keep up. There is also a deeper economic question. How much sense does it make for Russia to pour resources into refurbishing old hulls and building new tanks when each one may be destroyed by a drone that costs a tiny fraction of its value? Of course, this applies to any modern army, not just Russia. But again, the war in Ukraine is the laboratory where those economics are being tested in real time. The fourth lesson is psychological. When crews start welding any object they can find onto their vehicle for protection. When they fear drones as much as tanks fear anti-tank guns. When they abandon vehicles at the first sign of trouble because they no longer trust the armor. Then you have a morale problem, not just a tactical one. Tank warfare has always required crews who believed their vehicle gave them an edge. In Ukraine, Russian crews have often been sent into battle with aging machines, incomplete protection, and limited training time. That is a recipe for hesitation and risk aversion. In a high-intensity fight, hesitation gets you killed. So is the tank obsolete? I do not think so. What the Russian tank collapse really shows is that the tank has to evolve, and the system around it has to evolve even faster. Where armor still matters is in situations where protected mobility and heavy direct fire are needed to support infantry under fire. Urban assault, breaching fortified lines, counterattacking enemy breakthroughs. But a modern tank will need integrated drones of its own, active protection linked to a broader air defense network, low observable signatures in thermal and visual spectra, and above all, a command system that treats the tank as one node in a kill chain, not as a blunt instrument that can be sent forward on its own. For NATO planners and neighboring countries who might someday face Russian armor, the message is mixed. On one hand, the war has revealed serious weaknesses in Russian crews, logistics, and doctrine. It has shown that with the right mix of anti-tank weapons and drones, large armored forces can be blunted and even shattered. On the other hand, Russia is learning. Its industry is adapting. Its engineers are applying combat lessons to new batches of T-72B3M and T-90M tanks, adding drone nets and other protective features. It is also drawing heavily on foreign partners for ammunition and critical technologies. So the tank collapse is not a permanent state. It is a snapshot, a warning that if you fight yesterday's armored war in today's sensor-saturated battlefield, your vehicles will end up in flames. If Russia can adapt its combined arms doctrine, improve protection, and fix its logistics, its armor will remain dangerous. If it cannot, its tanks will continue to serve more as static fire support and symbols of past glory than as tools of decisive maneuver. For Ukraine, the war has already turned many Russian tanks into scrap metal or into trophies integrated into Ukrainian brigades. For Russia, it has revealed that a vast Soviet inheritance of armor is not enough to guarantee dominance. For the rest of the world, these burning wrecks are like a live fire lecture on 21st century land warfare. They say that armor still has a place, but only when it moves through a battlefield where information, protection, and logistics are as thick as its steel. In the end, Russian tank collapse, armor in flames, is not just a dramatic headline. It is a description of a deeper structural failure, a mismatch between doctrine and reality, between industrial ambition and actual output, between battlefield myth and battlefield physics. If you want to know what the future of armored warfare looks like, you will not find it in parade formations on Red Square. You will find it in drone footage of a single tank trying to move across a field under the watchful eyes of a dozen operators and sensors. Sometimes it makes it. Sometimes it ends in flames. The difference is not just the thickness of the armor. It is the intelligence, integration, and adaptability of the system that sent it there. Let us now zoom in closer on the hardware itself, because you cannot understand a tank collapse only from drone videos and satellite imagery. You need to look inside the steel. How were these vehicles built? What kind of protection did Russian crews actually sit behind? And why did so many of those design choices turn out to be liabilities once the war moved into the age of cheap sensors and precision explosives? Russian frontline armor in Ukraine has been dominated by upgraded Soviet-era designs like the T-72B3 and T-72B3M, the T-80BV and T-80BVM, and the T-90A and T-90M. On paper, the newer variants add exactly what you would expect for modern warfare. Thermal sights, better fire control, stronger engines, and reactive armor packages like Contact 5 and Relict layered over the basic steel and composite armor. The T-72B3M, for example, replaces older Contact 5 bricks with Relict ERA on the turret and hull front, and adds additional ERA side skirts and cage armor around the rear. It mounts the 125mm 2A46M5 gun and a Sosna U sighting system with thermal imaging and laser rangefinding. On a firing range, that combination gives credible first-round hit probability at long range in day or night conditions. If you put this tank in a clean duel on open terrain against older Western or Soviet designs, it is not some hopeless antique. It is dangerous. The T-90M goes further. It adds a redesigned turret with a turret bustle for some of the ammunition, modern Relict ERA, and improved engine power around 1,100 horsepower. Fire control includes digital ballistic computers and thermal imagers for both commander and gunner, bringing situational awareness much closer to Western third-generation tanks. The gun can fire standard APFSDS and heat rounds, plus reflex-guided missiles from the barrel. On paper, this looks like a serious main battle tank, especially if you imagine it fighting under an umbrella of Russian artillery and air defense. So how do we get from this technical spec sheet to images of burned T-90M wrecks on Ukrainian fields? Why do you see this supposedly elite tank knocked out by drones that cost less than one of its road wheels? The answer is partly in where the armor is, and partly in where it is not. Traditional Russian design philosophy prioritized frontal protection against kinetic penetrators and shaped charges fired from ground level. That means thick armor on the turret front and glacis, with ERA layered on top. But top armor, the roof of the turret and hull, remains relatively thin. Relict or contact bricks do not fully cover all vulnerable angles. When you introduce top attack missiles and FPV drones that can approach from above or dive onto the rear deck, you are now attacking the exact part of the tank that was never designed to be the strongest. Russian engineers understand this problem. There have been experiments with active protection systems like Arena and soft kill systems like Shtora, designed to disrupt or intercept incoming missiles. But these systems have not been fielded widely in Ukraine, partly due to cost, partly due to integration complexity, and partly due to industrial limitations under sanctions. As a result, many frontline tanks roll into battle with passive armor concepts that were state-of-the-art in the late Cold War, but are incomplete in an era where threats come from every axis, especially above. Now add the ammunition layout. Most T-72, T-80, and early T-90 variants store propellant charges and projectiles in a carousel under the turret ring. If a penetrator or shaped charge jet reaches that carousel, the propellant can ignite in milliseconds. Pressure builds. The turret ring fails. You get the jack-in-the-box effect that the world has seen repeatedly in videos from Ukraine. Newer designs like the T-90M add a turret bustle to move some rounds away from the crew and potentially vent explosions outward. Russian media have even discussed future modifications that relocate more ammunition to the rear compartment to increase survivability. But on the battlefield today, a large share of Russian tanks are still older T-72 and T-80 models with the classic, vulnerable carousel. So ask yourself this. If your tank has strong frontal armor but weak top protection and highly exposed ammunition, what happens? When you drive it into a battlefield dominated by drones that attack from high angles and guided missiles that target the turret roof, the outcome is almost pre-programmed. Penetrations are more likely to cause catastrophic kills. Crews know this. They have seen footage of their comrades' turrets blown into the air. Trust in the vehicle declines. Abandonments rise. You can see the improvisation in steel. Crews weld cage structures over turrets. They hang era bricks in crude patterns on roofs and sides. They bolt on logs, side plates, even air conditioning units used as makeshift standoff armor. At a distance, some of these tanks look less like standardized weapon systems and more like armored scrap piles. It is a visual signal that tactical reality is outrunning the factory design. What began as an attempt to protect against top attack often ends in added weight, reduced mobility, and clutter that interferes with sensors and crew egress. From a purely technical standpoint, Russian tanks in Ukraine are experiencing a collision between two timelines. The design timeline, where upgrades like Relict-era and T-90M turrets tried to stretch Soviet architectures into the modern era. And the threat timeline, where cheap drones, networked artillery, and advanced ATGMs have accelerated far faster than armored protection. When the threats evolve faster than your hulls, the result is what we see now: armor in flames. Let us move from the steel to one of the clearest case studies of tactical misuse: Vuhledar. If the early battles around Kyiv showed Russian armor collapsing in ambushes and traffic jams, Vuhledar in early 2023 showed something else: how not to attack a fortified position when your enemy has drones, artillery, and minefields ready. Vuhledar is a mining town in the Donbass region, sitting slightly elevated above the surrounding terrain. To the south and east are open fields that offer little concealment. Ukrainian troops from brigades like the 72nd were dug in around the town with good observation from high-rise buildings and access to artillery and drones. In January and February 2023, Russian forces, including the 155th and 40th Naval Infantry Brigades, attempted repeated assaults across those fields. The approach lanes were heavily mined. Russian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles advanced in columns along narrow, cleared paths. Once the leading vehicles hit mines and were disabled, the rest of the column bunched up behind them, unsure whether to bypass, reverse, or push through. Ukrainian drones hovered overhead, identifying vehicle positions and feeding correction data to artillery batteries and anti-tank teams. You can almost map the chain of failure step by step. Insufficient reconnaissance to detect mine density and alternate routes. Limited use of engineering vehicles in the very front to breach and mark safe paths. Columns stacked too tightly, violating basic dispersion principles. Armor pushed forward in daylight under an enemy that owned the local aerial reconnaissance picture. Artillery and ATGM teams used that picture to create choke point kill zones. The result was brutal. Western and Ukrainian sources estimate that in some of the worst days of fighting, Russian forces lost on the order of 100 or more armored vehicles in the Vuhledar sector, including dozens of tanks, in what has been called one of the biggest single armored disasters of the war. Videos show long rows of burned-out T-72s and T-80s scattered across fields, many incapacitated in almost identical positions, suggesting that the same mistakes were repeated over and over. Why would a competent command keep feeding armor into that kind of trap? The answer points back to doctrine and pressure. Russian forces needed to show offensive momentum in Donbass. They had naval infantry brigades that were politically prestigious and expected to deliver results. And they had tanks. So they did what many armies do under pressure. They used the tools they had in the way they had been trained, even when the context made that usage suicidal. From a tank warfare perspective, Vuhledar illustrates several classic errors magnified by modern technology. Maneuvering across open ground into known minefields without overwhelming suppression. Underestimating the enemy's ability to see and strike from long range. Stacking vehicles close enough that a single mine or kill can trap a whole column. And persisting with a plan even after evidence shows it is failing. This is where a little dry humor is appropriate. If you ever need a case study for a staff college on how to turn your tank battalion into a training aid for the enemy, Vuhledar will probably be on the first page. Not because Russian tanks are uniquely bad, but because Russian command turned those tanks into predictable, target-rich patterns that any half-decent opponent with drones and artillery could exploit. The deeper consequence of Vuhledar and similar battles is not just the number of hulls lost. It is the message to surviving crews. If you are a tank commander watching drone footage of your brigade's vehicles hitting mines in the same field for the third time in a week, what does that do to your confidence in higher command? When your superiors repeat failed patterns, armor does not just collapse physically, it collapses mentally. Now let us talk about something that rarely trends on social media: logistics and maintenance, the things that keep tanks moving before they ever meet a Javelin or an FPV drone. A modern main battle tank is a hungry machine. A T-72 or T-90 burns hundreds of liters of fuel per day in active operations. Tracks wear out. Engines require careful servicing. Optics and fire control need calibration. Reactive armor tiles must be checked and replaced after any damage. Every kilometer of movement and every hour of idling is adding tiny probabilities of breakdown. Russia entered the war with a Soviet-style logistics system oriented around railway delivery to large depots and then truck distribution forward. In peacetime exercises, fuel and spare parts flowed in relatively predictable patterns. In Ukraine, those patterns collided with long supply lines, partisan attacks, HIMARS strikes on depots, and chaotic routing as fronts shifted. Fuel trucks became high-value targets. Forward repair facilities had to operate under threat of precision strikes. Suddenly, it was not just a question of, do you have tanks on paper, but can you actually get a tank with fuel and working optics to the right village at 5 a.m. tomorrow? Open-source loss trackers like Oryx and War Spotting show not just destroyed tanks, but large numbers abandoned or captured intact or with relatively light damage. Abandonment often points to logistic breakdown. A vehicle runs out of fuel at the wrong moment. A track failure occurs and recovery assets cannot safely reach it. Crews are ordered to retreat quickly and are not given the time or tools to tow everything back. Or they simply decide that their lives are worth more than the hull and walk away. The early weeks north of Kyiv showed this dramatically. Columns outran their supply lines. Fuel ran low. Ukrainian forces ambushed convoys and captured intact vehicles. Farmers towing away T-72s with tractors made for amusing memes, but each of those videos hides a series of logistic failures. Inadequate planning for consumption rates, poor security for rear area convoys, slow decision-making on when to withdraw or reposition. As the war dragged on, Russian industry and logistics started to strain in a different way. Stored tanks pulled from depots required significant refurbishment. Decades in open-air storage meant corrosion, cannibalized parts, and outdated subsystems. Factories like Uralvagonzavod increased output of modernized T-72B3M and T-90M tanks, delivering new batches to the front. But at the same time, we see T-62s and even T-55s dragged out of storage and sent to combat units after minimal upgrades. What does it tell you when an army that claims to field advanced T-14 Armata prototypes is simultaneously shipping 1960s-era hulls to frontline units? On one level, it is rational. In a static trench war, an old tank used as a fixed gun is still useful. On another level, it is an admission that the industrial and logistics system cannot generate enough modern armor to replace losses, so quantity is preserved by sacrificing quality. Maintenance capacity is also a quiet bottleneck. To keep hundreds of tanks operational, you need trained mechanics, spare engines, transmissions, optics, and ERA stocks. Sanctions have restricted access to some high-tech components, especially in fire control and thermal imaging. Ukrainian analysis of captured T-90M tanks has found issues with component quality, including reports of low-grade electronics and hurried integration work. Every time you push a tank to the front with marginally integrated systems, you increase the chance that it fails at the worst moment. There is also the simple question of roads and mud. Ukraine's infamous Rasputitsa mud season does not care about doctrine. Heavy armored columns that stick to roads to avoid bogging down become more predictable targets. Vehicles that attempt to bypass through fields risk getting stuck, especially when overloaded with improvised armor and supplies. Recovery under drone surveillance becomes a nightmare. So logistics and terrain conspire with enemy action to magnify every mechanical weakness. If you combine all of this, you get a battlefield where Russian tank availability is shaped as much by fuel, maintenance, and spare parts as by enemy fire. Each destroyed hull is a clear data point, but each tank left immobile in a tree line because it has no spare track and no towing vehicle is part of the same collapse. Next, we have to look at the human side inside the turret. Because a main battle tank is not really steel and electronics, it is 3 or 4 people making decisions under stress. Pre-war, Russia had a professional corps of tank crews, especially in elite formations like Kantemirovskaya and Tamanskaya divisions and selected brigades. These crews trained regularly and had some exposure to modernized vehicles. However, much of the force still followed Soviet-style conscript rotation, where soldiers served short terms and then left. This makes building long-term crew cohesion harder compared to fully professional armies. Once the invasion turned into a war of attrition, experienced crews started to die. Russian casualties overall climbed into the hundreds of thousands killed and wounded, according to Western estimates. Tank units, often used in high-risk assaults and counterattacks, paid a heavy price. Replacing those crews required accelerated training programs for mobilized soldiers. In some cases, reports suggest mobilized tankers received only a few weeks of training before being sent to the front. Ask yourself how comfortable you would feel as a new gunner, with minimal time behind the sight, driving into a labyrinth of mines and drones. You are expected to use a relatively complex fire control system, coordinate with infantry and artillery, and react to threats from all angles. One misjudged hull orientation, one failure to notice a drone shadow, one missed cue about a likely mine lane, and your vehicle becomes another statistic. The psychological environment is equally harsh. Crews know that their vehicles are visible from the sky. They see videos on Telegram of FPV drones diving into open hatches. They read rumors that any immobilized tank will quickly be hit by incendiary munitions to ensure its destruction. They see improvised turtle tanks covered in cages and wonder if this is real protection or just theater. Over time, this changes behavior. Crews take fewer risks. Commanders are more cautious about pushing forward. Vehicles are used more for static fire support from covered positions instead of aggressive maneuver. From a survival perspective, that is rational. From a doctrinal perspective, it undercuts the role of tanks as breakthrough instruments. The collapse of crew confidence also shows up in abandonment patterns. When crews believe that staying with a bogged down or lightly damaged tank is a death sentence, they are more likely to bail out early. This is especially true in units with weaker discipline and more mobilized personnel. Each abandoned vehicle may be recovered by Ukrainian forces, repaired, and sent back into battle with a new flag painted on it. That is the final insult. Your tank does not just die, it switches sides. We should also note that Ukrainian forces, while suffering their own losses, have tried to concentrate their more modern Western tanks in better trained units, using them relatively carefully and learning from each engagement. They, too, have discovered that armor without infantry, engineering, and drone support bleeds badly. The difference is that Ukraine has rarely thrown tank units into attritional frontal assaults on the same scale and repetition that Russia has. So crew morale and confidence, while under severe strain, have not collapsed in the same way. In summary, the human factor inside Russian armor has moved through 3 stages. Initial overconfidence that the war would be quick and that tanks would play a decisive role. Shock and disillusionment as losses mounted and tactical failures like Vuhledar piled up. And a grinding adaptation phase where crews try to survive in a battlefield environment that feels fundamentally hostile to heavy armor. You can upgrade armor and guns, but if you do not upgrade training, leadership, and crew trust, The collapse continues. All of this brings us to a bigger question. What does the Russian tank collapse mean for the future of armored warfare in general? Is this the death of the tank, or the death of a specific way of using tanks? First, we should be cautious about declaring the tank obsolete. Every time a new threat appears, someone announces the end of armor. Machine guns in World War I, Panzerfausts in World War II, ATGMs in the 1970s, attack helicopters in the 1980s. Each time, armies adapted with better protection, tactics, and combined arms. The result was not the end of tanks, but the evolution of tanks. However, the Ukrainian battlefield does highlight three hard requirements for future armor. The first is integrated protection against drones and top attack munitions. This means not just thicker roof plates, but layered active protection systems, jammers, decoys, and tactics that reduce predictability. A tank platoon in the 2030s will need its own drone swarm for reconnaissance and possibly for self-defense, just as past platoons needed organic infantry screens. The second requirement is information dominance. Tanks can no longer rely on a commander poking his head out of the hatch with binoculars as their primary sensor. They have to be plugged into a network of UAV feeds, ground sensors, and digital maps. Russia has tried to move in this direction with updated communications and battle management systems for the T-90M. But the war shows that technical potential means little if the wider army's C2 structure is rigid and slow. The third requirement is doctrinal honesty. If your army writes beautiful combined arms manuals but cannot execute them under fire, then tanks will die. Modern armor must be employed with continuous engineering support, dense infantry cooperation, rapid artillery integration, and agile logistics. What failed in Russia's case was not just hardware, but the system that should have kept that hardware supported, informed, and used in the right places at the right times. Here is a simple thought experiment. If you took a battalion of Leopard 2A6 or Abrams tanks and forced them to attack Vuhledar in the same way Russian units did in early 2023. Same minefields, same lack of recon, same rigid routes, same exposure to drones and artillery. Do you think the outcome would be fundamentally different? You would probably see fewer catastrophic kills thanks to better ammunition storage and armor layout. But the battalion would still get chewed up, because the core problem is not the brand name on the hull. It is the mismatch between doctrine, support, and the threat environment. Where Russia has provided a grim service to the world is in demonstrating this mismatch at scale. By losing over 4,000 tanks visually confirmed, and likely far more in reality, Moscow has unintentionally run a giant live experiment on what happens when heavy armor is thrown into a sensor-saturated battlefield with partial adaptation. The answer is clear enough that any serious planner should pay attention. For Russia, the path forward is not easy. It can continue to push refurbished T-62s and upgraded T-72s to the front, hoping that sheer quantity will stabilize the line. It can accelerate production of T-90M tanks with incremental improvements to ammo layout and protection. It can try to deploy more effective active protection and electronic warfare around its armored units. But each of these steps costs time and resources, both of which are being burned at high rates in Ukraine. For Ukraine and its partners, the lesson is more encouraging but also sobering. Layered anti-armor networks built around drones, artillery, and ATGMs can neutralize a numerically superior armored force. However, armor on the defensive side is still valuable for counterattacks and exploitation once enemy assaults are blunted. You can see that in the way Ukraine uses captured Russian tanks and Western-supplied vehicles as mobile fire support and local offensive tools, rather than as independent deep strike formations. For other countries watching from the sidelines, the Russian tank collapse is a warning label attached to their own doctrines. If you still have manuals written for a 1990s battlefield with limited UAVs and sparse precision fires, you are behind. If your procurement focuses on thicker armor without an equal focus on drones, EW, and C2, you are repeating the same mistakes in slow motion. And if your officers believe that bravery and armor alone can punch through modern defenses without detailed recon and engineering, then you may someday find your own armored brigades decorating a field on somebody else's drone feed. In the end, the story of Armor in Flames is less about the death of the tank and more about the death of complacency. Russian tanks did not collapse because steel suddenly stopped working. They collapsed because the ecosystem around that steel failed to keep pace with the threats, because Doctrine did not adapt quickly enough, because logistics and industry could not sustain quality at the rate that the war consumed it, and because crews were asked to do the impossible in vehicles that no longer matched the battlefield they were thrown into. If there is one final question worth leaving hanging in the air, it is this. What would Russian armor look like today if Moscow had invested the same effort into combined arms integration, active protection, and crew training that it did into refurbishing old hulls and parading prototypes? Would we still be talking about a tank collapse? Or would Ukraine be facing a very different kind of opponent? We cannot know for sure. But every burned-out T-72 on the steppe is a quiet argument that in modern war, you cannot shortcut adaptation with nostalgia and mass.